I've got a new record coming out on BBE, Supreme Love, A Journey Through Coltrane. I've got the single Starchild out very shortly, I think 2nd of April. Then I've got another single, Azawala. And then the album itself, which is a triple album. And I think it's quite a unique record in that I'm using many of my favourite musicians from all styles, all genres, from the beginnings of my career. I'm working with two guys, Kaidi Tatham and Daz IQ, from a group called Bugs in the Attic, who I started working with maybe, right at the beginning of my career, 20 years ago, a long time ago. Because being from the West London scene, they were from the West London scene. We're all born in the same area, so to speak. Though Kaidi, I think Kaidi's from outside of London and he moved to West London. But yeah, there were a lot of labels around there at that time. So I've got those two guys, and I've also collaborated with two of my favourite older UK musicians. One of them has just passed away, Peter King. The listeners might not know Peter, but Peter played with Elvin Jones, Coltrane's drummer. He also played with Philly Joe Jones, Miles Davis's drummer. So he was a connection from the old school, the very old school, to this sort of new school. And a guitarist in the Average White Band who lives here, a Scottish guy called Jim Mullen, who's I've worked with on a few records. And Peter King was actually a good friend of mine, so it was quite nice to actually bring all these strands together and make this record, because these guys would never ever work with each other, because what's the beauty of London is that all the scenes are almost separated. They're so disparate that, I don't know what it's like in LA or New York, but here you can have a career and not be on the jazz scene, or you can have a career completely solely in the jazz scene, or making studio electronic music, or my whole life has been just dipping in to a different scene. So I've been able to, as I said, work with guys from the UK, sort of very jazz scene, and then work with a broken beat scene. Actually, I would say I'm more at home with the electronic sound, I suppose. I haven't made an electronic record for a long time, but I've been involved in remixes and with various people, but generally making a record in the electronic genre, I haven't done that for many a year, but I still feel affiliated with them more because they're more open than the UK jazz scene, which is a very closed scene. It's very protective, UK jazz. All scenes are protective, all scenes are protective. I'm a bit of a fly. I just fly around, float around, That's been my thing. I'd like to actually explain what happened to Broken Beat. I know there wasn't many of us at the beginning, and what I've seen subsequently is people suddenly saying they were there when they weren't. Yeah, there was one label, it was Goya Music. Goya helped Bugs, they helped IG, they helped Phil Asher, they had Ego from 2000 Black. They helped me, they gave me my first album deal. I was a nobody. Everything I've got since then has come via Broken Beat, from them initially giving me money, and then my confidence shot up and I was able to start applying for things, jobs, etc. But what actually happened, and I spoke to Daz IQ, you obviously know Daz. I'm in regular contact with Daz because I'm quite close with Daz. It was partly the internet that killed it, partly no support really from the sort of underground mainstream, that it was so grudgingly supported, only because people started loving that music, and we started playing bigger venues, and then a few of us, like Bugs and I think IG Culture signed a deal with Virgin. But the internet killed the sound, number one. And I don't think the record industry, even the people at the time, the sort of underground, understood the music. It's a very layered kind of dance music. It's quite complex. It's got a lot of varieties, and it was a very wide church. You know, and that wide church sort of, they might, you know, for instance, a DJ from the broken beat scene like an IG might not be a jazz musician, but he would use jazz guys. He'd be clever enough to use certain guys. I just remember him working with Frank McCone, and some wonderful stuff from back in the day. I know Four Hero working with some jazz guys, some lovely string arrangements with some of the jazz guys there. I just hired lots of guys that I really admired on my records. Then I worked with Daz on the beats. It was a broad church, but there weren't many of us. And the recognition came after the internet destroyed the scene. You know, that's for me strange, really, because then suddenly it got really popular again, which is really weird. You know, because at the time it was only one label taking a risk. And those two guys went bankrupt. I just got to give a mention, and everyone knows those guys. It's Mike Slocum and Spencer Weeks. Those are the two guys that put their nuts on the line for that scene. They put a load of money. Phil Asher, God rest Phil's soul, he took me down to Goya Music and said to Mike in front of me that this guy's talented, he should be putting records out. And Mike gave me £500 straight away. 20 years ago, they had checks, yeah? And they wrote them on pieces of paper. And he wrote me a check out for 500 quid. Just said, look, here's a couple of days in the studio. I said, what? I was in shock. You know, what the hell? I've been trying to get a record deal for 3 years. 3 years. I demoed stuff for Sony. I had a contact at Sony Records, and they weren't interested. They said the music was too complicated. It was too this. It was too jazzy. It was too da 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 da. It was too soulful. You know, it was a bit prototype D'Angelo, because I got heavily into D'Angelo, but I was into that style even before I heard D'Angelo. I thought, okay, he's done it now, because there was a track that I wrote that's very similar to what he was doing. And Mike heard the demo and just said, look, yeah, it's 500 quid. And then bam, off we went. But they were the only two guys. You know, they were the only two guys. Now it's all this experimental stuff it seems to be, you know, it seems to have gone into the mainstream, which is great, you know, because I like listening to stuff now, whereas before I didn't really. I got a bit bored of the soul stuff. It was only Stevie Wonder from the 70s that I was, and the early American 70s stuff that I liked on the soul scene, you know. And then there was this big sort of gap that wasn't being taken care of, and then until the neo soul. Omar here as well. He's another great guy. I've got to mention Omar. So, you know, he yeah, you know, that neo soul thing. So Mike just allowed me to do my thing, and that's what Broken Beat was. A bunch of guys just with no cover. You're allowed to do your thing, you know. And he just said he didn't care. Phil just said to Mike that, you know, Sean's a talented guy, give him a chance. So yeah, just wrote a check straight away, and I just went into the studio with my really good mate of mine, Victor Starking. I had two songs. I wrote a tune called Reaching for the Far Side, and then Mike asked me, had I heard of Bugs in the Attic, and I hadn't heard of Bugs in the Attic 20 years ago. He told me to go down to the studio, arranged for me to go down to the studio, and I hooked up with Daz and Kaidi. It's the first time I met those guys, a long time ago, and I got on very well with them. You know, we're all in the same boat. You know, we'd all been trying for a few years, and we all came up against a brick wall, and then suddenly two guys decided to leave their jobs at major record labels and start their own label up and put their own money into it. And they started giving people bloody checks. It's like, whoa. And then that's basically it. And then it blew up. It did blow up. I started playing gigs I couldn't even imagine I would do. I started playing in front of really much bigger audiences, started going to Europe. But the internet killed it, number one. And then, as I said, the mainstream underground didn't embrace it. And and push it, because they weren't really involved, because it was only really Mike and Spence taking a risk. And then there you have it. There's a story of Broken Beat in about 5 minutes flat. The album Supreme Love, Journey Through Coltrane is my take on Coltrane. Coltrane's music. I'm doing some arrangements, doing some originals of my own that I've used Coltrane as an inspiration. As I said, I've brought different guys from different scenes together. The album's in 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Part 1 is the main body of the album, where I take some Coltrane bits, arrangements, rejig it, put my own spin on things. Part 2 is working with the Broken Beat guys that I've just mentioned. Part 3, I'm working with Peter King. Just a little shout out to Peter King, who passed away this year. Sadly. Pete was one of the best saxophone players in the world. He was world renowned. Maybe some of your listeners wouldn't have heard of Peter, but he'd worked with Ray Charles. He'd worked with, he played with Bud Powell. He'd worked with Philly Joe Jones from Miles Davis's group. He played with Elvin Jones. He toured with Elvin Jones. He made a record with Philly Joe Jones in the 60s. He's an icon in Europe, and you know, it should be more well known. But he had many. He had a sort of issues with drugs and stuff, which impeded his career. But I was very lucky to get Pete on, because he was quite a good friend of mine. So that he's involved in part 3, and there's a Coltrane theme running through the whole record. So it's part autobiography, it's part encyclopedia of Coltrane, and it's part homage to Coltrane. Just saying thanks for keeping me motivated in this game and holding on long enough till I got a few breaks, you know, and so I can make a record. For me, making records is my lifeblood, and it's my novel. You know, you talk about writers being able to put their work out, and yeah, I've got quite a novelistic and quite conceptual approach to when I make a record. So, you know, that's what the record's about. Well, I just want to say thanks to BBE and Fusicology for you know, being interviewed, etc., and spreading the word in the States, and also someone so knowledgeable as you about the broken scene. I was a bit surprised actually, because I thought it was just such a UK West London thing, but everyone keeps telling me, yeah, people are loving Broken Beat now. It's like, whoa, you know, but shout out to, you know, Pete, all the BBE guys. A shout out to Mike Slocum and Spencer Weeks from Goya Music, Victor Starkey, Will Worsley, who helped me mix this record, which is a very difficult record to mix, because we had 12 string players, we had a harpist, we had 2 drummers on one track, double bass. I went crazy on this record. I put everything into this record, so it was a mammoth task to mix it down. So I thank Will Worsley, who has got an amazing studio, and he generally makes a fortune working for Netflix and the BBC, but he gives me a big squeeze when I go down to his studio, because it's, you know, it's very high spec. He's quite a good friend to my career, and Vic Starkey, as I said, those 2 are the guys that mixed a very, very difficult record down. Any more shout outs? Shout out to Azimuth, who I was working with the Brazilian group Azimuth a year ago, trying to put some music together, and I will finish that soon, guys. You know, I will finish that soon, but COVID has just completely been like a hammer on the head. Anyone else? Let me think. My daughter, she doesn't really like my music, because she likes R&B and really weird, sort of very modern R&B, which I think, but Amelia McGinley, I love you. And who else? All my friends in Portugal. I miss all my family in Portugal. I'll be there soon, God willing.